My sister-in-law has been sabotaging my marriage for years, and when I exposed her, my husband took her side. Now I'm wondering if my marriage is even worth saving. I'm 30F, married to Jake, 34M for 5 years. From the outside, we seem like a happy, normal couple. But lately, I've felt like a stranger in my own marriage. At the center of it all is his sister, Megan, 28F. Megan has always been close to Jake. Too close, if you ask me. At first, I thought it was sweet that they were so connected, but it's turned into something else entirely. She's constantly at our house, inserting herself into our plans and making subtle digs that Jake never seems to notice. I tried to ignore it, but over time, it started wearing on me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Megan would make comments like, "Oh, you're so lucky Jake settled for you," or, "Jake used to date women who cooked every night." She'd say it with a smile, but there was always a sting behind her words. I mentioned it to Jake, but he just laughed it off. "That's just how Megan is," he'd say. "Don't take it personally." So I tried not to. But then she started showing up unannounced, always needing something, always with a reason to stick around and take over my space. One weekend, we planned a romantic getaway for our anniversary. I was so excited. I'd spent weeks planning everything. The night before we were supposed to leave, Megan showed up, looking upset and claiming she'd just broken up with her boyfriend. "I need my brother," she said dramatically, throwing herself onto our couch. Jake immediately started comforting her, and before I knew it, our trip was canceled. I tried to explain to Jake that she was manipulating him, but he wasn't having it. "Family comes first," he said, like I wasn't even part of that family. Things escalated when Megan started interfering in our finances. She'd ask Jake for money constantly, claiming she was between jobs or had some new crisis. We'd set up a savings account to buy a house, but every time I checked, there seemed to be less in there. I confronted Jake, and he admitted he'd been lending Megan money without telling me. "She's my sister, and she needs help," he argued. "You're being selfish." I was shocked. I couldn't believe he'd chosen her over our future. But he couldn't see it. He was blinded by loyalty to her. Megan didn't stop there. She'd openly criticize my appearance, saying things like, "Oh, Jake always liked blondes. Are you sure you don't want to dye your hair?" Or, "You've put on a little weight, haven't you?" Jake used to date women who were really into fitness. It hurt, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to cause trouble between Jake and his sister. But the worst part was that Jake never defended me. He'd just laugh, sometimes even agreeing with her. I felt humiliated, constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd ever be good enough for him or for her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Jake we needed to set boundaries with Megan. I explained how her constant presence and snide comments were affecting me and our marriage. To my surprise, he snapped back at me. "She's my sister, and she's going to be a part of my life whether you like it or not," he yelled. I was stunned. It felt like he was choosing her over me, like I didn't matter at all. I walked away that night, feeling more alone than ever. I started questioning my place in his life, and if he even saw me as his partner. Not long after that argument, Megan started coming by even more frequently. She'd show up during dinner, stay until late, and always find a way to make me feel like an outsider. One night, she brought over some old photos of Jake with his ex-girlfriends. She sat there, flipping through them, reminiscing about the good old days right in front of me. "Remember when you dated Lisa? She was so gorgeous," Megan said, laughing. I felt sick. When I confronted Jake about how inappropriate it was, he just shrugged and told me to stop being so insecure. I started noticing other things too. Megan would often go through our stuff, even our bedroom, claiming she was looking for something she'd left behind. She'd make comments about my clothes, my perfume, my makeup, saying things like, "You're wearing that? Jake prefers more natural looks." It was like she was trying to turn me into someone else, someone who fit her idea of what Jake deserved. When I told Jake, he just brushed it off, saying I was overreacting. I felt trapped in my own home, like I was competing with his sister for a place in my own marriage. The breaking point came when I overheard a phone conversation between Megan and Jake. She didn't know I was listening, and I heard her say, "You could do so much better than her, you know. She's holding you back." My heart dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I confronted her about it later, but she just smiled and said, "I'm just looking out for my brother. You can't blame me for that." Jake refused to believe me, saying I was trying to drive a wedge between him and his sister. I felt defeated, like I was fighting a losing battle. That night, I realized I needed evidence. I started documenting everything: her comments, her visits, even the financial transactions. I kept a journal and took pictures, hoping that one day, Jake would see what I was dealing with. I felt like a spy in my own home, gathering proof of the toxic influence his sister had on our lives. I knew I had to confront him, but I needed to do it in a way that would open his eyes to the damage she was causing. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, wondering when the next attack would come. One day, Megan overstepped in a way that even Jake couldn't ignore. She decided to redecorate our living room while I was at work. I came home to find new furniture, new paint colors, and a completely different setup. It was like I'd walked into someone else's house. When I confronted her, she said, "Well, Jake told me you've been wanting to redecorate. I figured I'd help you out." I turned to Jake, expecting him to defend me, but he just looked uncomfortable and mumbled, "She was just trying to help." I was furious. This was my home, my space, and she'd violated it. That evening, I finally showed Jake the journal. I laid out all the things she'd done, all the times she'd insulted me, undermined me, and tried to push me out. I'd even showed him the bank statements, proving how much of our savings had gone to her. He looked shocked, but instead of apologizing, he got defensive. "You've been spying on us," he accused. "How could you do this to my family?" I couldn't believe it. Here I was, showing him proof of the way his sister had manipulated him, and he was acting like I was the one in the wrong. In that moment, something inside me broke. I realized that no matter what I showed him, no matter how much evidence I had, he would always take her side. She had some kind of hold over him, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to break it. "I can't believe you're choosing her over me," I whispered, feeling tears prick at my eyes. He just stared at me, his expression cold. "She's my sister," he said simply, as if that justified everything. I turned and walked out of the room, feeling like my marriage was slipping through my fingers. The next day, I stayed with a friend. I needed space, a break from the toxic environment that had become my home. While I was away, Jake kept calling, but I didn't answer. I needed time to think, to decide what I wanted. Part of me wanted to save my marriage, to fight for the man I loved. But another part of me wondered if there was anything left worth saving. I'd given everything to Jake, and in return, he'd allowed his sister to poison our relationship. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him for that, or if I even wanted to. After a few days, I agreed to meet Jake for coffee. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. "I miss you," he said, reaching for my hand. I pulled back, needing to keep my distance. "Do you really?" I asked, my voice cold. "Or do you just miss having someone around to cook and clean for you?" He flinched at my words. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "I love you, and I want to make this work." I shook my head. "You say that, but actions speak louder than words, Jake. And right now, your actions are telling me you're more committed to your sister than to me." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what you want me to do," he admitted. "She's my family. She's always been there for me." I looked him in the eye, feeling a surge of anger. "And what am I, Jake? Am I not your family too? Or does that only apply when it's convenient?" He didn't answer, and the silence between us was deafening. I realized then that he'd never truly seen me as an equal partner. I was always second place, always competing with his sister for his attention, his loyalty, his love. I wasn't sure I could keep living like that. That night, I went back to the house to pack a bag. I wasn't ready to make any final decisions, but I needed some space to clear my head. As I was packing, Megan showed up, looking smug. "Running away," she taunted, crossing her arms. "I knew you couldn't handle being a part of this family." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. "You've been trying to sabotage my marriage for years," I shot back. "But you know what? You're not worth my energy. I'm done letting you control my life." She laughed, clearly unfazed. "We'll see how long you last without Jake." I packed my things and left, staying with my friend again. I expected Jake to reach out, to apologize, to try to make things right, but days passed, and I heard nothing. It felt like he'd chosen Megan, like he was perfectly content letting me walk away. I started to question everything, wondering if I'd made the right decision. Maybe I was the one overreacting. Maybe I should have tried harder to make peace with his sister. But then I remembered all the times she'd undermined me, all the ways she tried to tear us apart, and I knew I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for their twisted bond. Eventually, Jake did reach out. He called me one night, his voice filled with desperation. "I miss you," he said. "I want to make this work. I'm willing to set boundaries with Megan if that's what it takes." For a moment, I felt a spark of hope. But then he added, "But you have to be willing to compromise too. She's my sister, and she'll always be part of my life." His words felt like a slap in the face. Even now, after everything, he was asking me to bend, to make space for the very person who tried to destroy us. I wasn't sure I could do it. I told him I needed more time to think. He sounded disappointed, but he agreed. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work, into friends, into anything that could distract me from the pain. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some clarity. I realized that I'd spent so much time trying to please Jake and Megan, trying to fit into their version of a family, that I'd lost myself in the process. I began to wonder if maybe this was a chance for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms, free from their toxic influence. One day, out of the blue, Megan showed up at my workplace. She looked smug as always, leaning against the reception desk with a smirk. "Are you really this pathetic?" she asked, loud enough for my coworkers to hear. "Dragging this out, making Jake miserable. Just let him go if you can't handle being his wife." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. I couldn't believe she'd stoop so low as to humiliate me at my job. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Get out," I said quietly. "You have no right to be here. This is my life, not yours." After she left, I realized I couldn't keep letting her control me. I couldn't keep living in fear of her next move, of the way she manipulated Jake. I went home that night and finally confronted him, telling him everything she'd done, every way she'd tried to tear us apart. "This is your last chance," I said, my voice shaking. "Either you set boundaries with Megan, or I'm done. I can't keep doing this." He looked stunned, like he'd never truly realized the extent of her influence. But then he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I can't just cut her out," he said quietly. "She's my sister." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized then that he was never going to change. No matter how much I begged, no matter how much I proved myself, he would always choose her. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "Then I guess this is goodbye," I said, my voice steady. He looked at me, shocked. "You're really going to throw this all away?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in years. "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied. "I'm finally choosing myself." Packing up my things was surreal. I'd spent years building a life with Jake, a life that I thought would last forever. But as I folded clothes and boxed up memories, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I was finally breaking free from the toxic grip that had held me down for so long. Megan had won in a way, but I didn't care anymore. I was done fighting for someone who wasn't willing to fight for me. I was done sacrificing my happiness for the sake of a family that had never truly accepted me. It was time to move on. The hardest part was facing the judgment from friends and family who didn't understand. Some of them thought I was overreacting, that I should have tried harder to make things work. Others told me I was brave, that I deserved better. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of Megan's influence. I couldn't keep sacrificing my self-worth for the sake of a marriage that had never truly valued me. I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that I'd made the right decision, even if it hurt. In the weeks that followed, Jake tried reaching out again. He called, texted, even showed up at my friend's house, begging me to come back. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. I didn't realize how much she was affecting us. "I'll talk to her. I'll set boundaries." But it was too late. I'd given him chance after chance, and he'd chosen her every time. I couldn't trust him to change, and I couldn't trust myself to keep fighting for something that was already broken. I told him to let me go, to let me find happiness on my own. He looked devastated, but I knew it was the right choice. Eventually, I filed for divorce. It was a painful process, filled with memories of the life we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared. But as I signed the papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally free from the toxic hold that Megan had over my life, free from the constant feeling of inadequacy. I knew it wouldn't be easy, rebuilding my life from scratch. But I also knew that I was strong enough to do it. I'd spent years sacrificing myself for the sake of others, and now it was time to put myself first. Megan didn't waste any time. She spread rumors, telling everyone who would listen that I was the one who'd abandoned Jake, that I was selfish and ungrateful. I'd heard the whispers, felt the judgment, but I didn't let it get to me. I knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into rebuilding my life on my own terms. I found strength in my independence and the knowledge that I didn't need anyone else to define my worth. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. One day, out of the blue, I received a letter from Jake. He apologized for everything, for choosing his sister over me, for not realizing the damage she'd done. He asked for a second chance, promising that he'd changed, that he was willing to cut ties with Megan if that's what it took. I read the letter, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to go back to the life we'd built together. But I knew that I couldn't. I'd already made my choice, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice myself again. I wrote back, telling him that I appreciated his apology but that I needed to move on. I explained that I'd spent too long trying to please him, trying to fit into a life that had never truly valued me. I wished him well, hoping that he would find peace, but I made it clear that I was done. I couldn't go back to a life of compromise, to a marriage that had been tainted by betrayal. I was finally free, and I wasn't willing to give that up for anyone, not even him. It was a painful decision, but it was the right one. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I started traveling, exploring new places, meeting new people. I found joy in the simple things, in the freedom that came from living life on my own terms. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and slowly but surely, I began to heal. The scars from my marriage were still there, reminders of the pain I'd endured. But they were also reminders of my strength, of my ability to overcome even the most toxic relationships. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let anything hold me back. One evening, I ran to Megan at a coffee shop. She looked surprised to see me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she smirked, clearly amused. "So, how's the single life?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. "It's amazing, actually," I replied. "I'm finally living for myself." Her smirk faltered, and I could tell she didn't know how to respond. For the first time, I saw her for what she really was, a sad, insecure woman who thrived on tearing others down. I didn't need her approval anymore. I walked away from that encounter feeling lighter than I had in years. I realized that I didn't need to prove myself to anyone, least of all to Megan. I'd spent so much time trying to fit into her version of a family, trying to earn her approval, that I'd forgotten my own worth. But now I was free. I was finally living life on my own terms, free from the toxic influence of people who had never truly valued me. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I was strong enough to walk away from anything that didn't serve me. As time passed, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through. I realized that the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, they'd all been necessary steps on my journey to self-discovery. I'd learned to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, to demand respect. I'd learned that I didn't need anyone else to define my worth, that I was strong enough to face anything life threw at me. I felt a sense of gratitude, knowing that I'd come out of this experience stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I was finally free, and I wasn't going to let anything hold me back. One day, I received a message from Jake. He told me he'd cut ties with Megan, that he'd finally realized the damage she'd done to our marriage. He asked if we could meet, if we could talk, if there was any chance of reconciliation. I read the message, feeling a pang of sadness. Part of me wanted to say yes, to give him another chance. But I knew that I couldn't. I'd already made my choice, and I wasn't willing to go back. I'd come too far, grown too much, to let myself fall back into that toxic cycle. I replied, wishing him well, but making it clear that I'd moved on. I told him that I was grateful for the lessons I'd learned, for the strength I'd gained. But I also told him that I was done looking back, done holding on to the past. I'd spent too long living for others, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of a marriage that had never truly valued me. Now I was finally free, and I wasn't willing to give that up for anyone, not even him. It was a painful decision, but it was the right one, and I knew it in my heart.